What if the pharaohs who ruled Egypt were never the true inheritors of the solar mysteries? And what if there existed a lineage that predated the dynasties themselves, daughters born under specific celestial alignments who carried in their blood the direct transmission of Ra's consciousness, women who could channel the eye of the sun itself and whose very existence threatened the power structures that claimed divine authority through conquest rather than through the sacred inheritance that could only pass through the feminine line. In the Valley of the Kings, where tourists marvel at tombs built for men who declared themselves gods, there exists a chamber that no archaeologist has documented, sealed during the reign of Akhenaten, when he attempted to restore what had been hidden and was punished for that restoration by having his name erased from every monument and his revolution undone by those who understood that the solar lineage could not be allowed to return to power without dismantling everything the priesthood had built upon its suppression. In the autumn of 2019, an Egyptologist named Dr. Yasmin Khalil was conducting ground-penetrating radar surveys in a section of the valley that conventional wisdom declared exhausted of tombs, searching not for royal burials, but for evidence of the workers' settlements that must have existed to support the massive construction projects. Her equipment registered an anomaly that made no geological sense, a void approximately 30 meters below the surface, far deeper than any known tomb, accessible only through a vertical shaft that appeared to have been deliberately filled with limestone rubble and sealed with prayers meant to prevent rather than protect, warnings carved in hieroglyphs that no one should disturb what lay beneath, because what was hidden for the preservation of the cosmic order itself. Yasmin spent 6 months obtaining permissions and assembling a team skilled enough to excavate without destroying. And when they finally cleared the shaft and descended into the chamber at its base, she was the first to see what the priests of Amun had buried 3,000 years earlier in their determination to ensure that the solar lineage would never rise again. The walls were covered with paintings executed in a style that predated the canonical Egyptian art, images that showed women performing ceremonies under the open sun, their bodies generating spirals of golden light that connected them directly to the solar disk without the mediation of priests or temples, or the elaborate theology that had been constructed to explain why only men could serve as intermediaries between humanity and the divine. In the center of the chamber stood a sarcophagus carved from a single block of red granite, and when Yasmin's team carefully removed the lid, they found not a mummy prepared for the afterlife, according to the standard funerary practices, but a body that had been preserved through a method that left the skin still supple after millennia, still bearing the golden hue that the paintings on the walls depicted, still radiating a subtle warmth that the infrared cameras registered, but that no one could explain through any known chemical or biological process. The woman in the sarcophagus wore no jewelry and no amulets, none of the protective symbols that accompanied every other burial Yasmin had ever excavated. Instead, her forehead bore a mark that had been tattooed or branded into the skin, a symbol that combined the sun disk with the eye of Ra in a configuration that appeared nowhere in the extensive iconography that Yasmin had studied throughout her career. And clutched in the woman's hands was a scroll made from papyrus that should have disintegrated millennia ago, but that remained intact, sealed with wax that bore an impression Yasmin recognized immediately as the cartouche of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who had tried to overthrow the priesthood and restore the worship of a single solar deity before being destroyed by the very forces he had challenged. Yasmin removed the scroll with trembling hands, breaking the seal that had held for 3,000 years, and she began to read words that would transform everything she thought she understood about Egyptian religion and the role of women in the ancient world. The text was written in hieratic script by the woman whose body lay in the sarcophagus, a priestess who identified herself as the last of the solar daughters, the final keeper of a lineage that stretched back to the founding of Egyptian civilization and beyond, back to a time that predated the pharaohs and the dynasties, back to the age when the relationship between humanity and the sun was not mediated through institutions, but experienced directly through women whose very biology made them natural channels for solar consciousness. I am Nefertari, though that is not the name I was given at birth, but the name I took when I became the vessel of Ra's eye, the scroll began. I write this testimony in the year that Akhenaten was overthrown and the old priesthood restored, knowing that what I record here will be hidden by those who fear the truth I carry, but trusting that someday, when the age of suppression ends and the feminine solar mysteries can be remembered without triggering the violent reaction that has characterized every attempt to restore them, someone will find these words and understand what was lost and what must be reclaimed. Nefertari described a tradition that had been ancient when the first pyramid was built, a practice maintained by women who were born under specific astronomical alignments that marked them as potential carriers of the solar transmission. These women were identified at birth by priestesses trained to read the celestial signatures, and they were raised in temples dedicated not to the worship of Ra as an external deity, but to the cultivation of the solar consciousness that lived within them, the capacity to generate and channel the same creative power that the sun embodied in the macrocosm. The sun does not rule the earth, Nefertari wrote, with a clarity that challenged 3,000 years of pharaonic ideology. The sun nourishes the earth. The sun gives life without demanding submission. The sun shines on all equally, making no distinction between the worthy and the unworthy, the powerful and the powerless. This is the true nature of solar consciousness, and this is what we embodied as solar daughters. We were not rulers but nourishers, not conquerors but cultivators, not authorities demanding obedience but sources offering sustenance to all who needed it. She explained that the solar daughters had served as healers and oracles, their ability to channel solar consciousness, granting them capacities that seemed miraculous, but that were actually natural expressions of consciousness, aligned with the creative principle of the universe. They could perceive illness before it manifested in physical symptoms, seeing the disruptions in the energy field that would eventually produce disease if left unaddressed. They could speak prophecies that guided communities through periods of transition and uncertainty, not because they saw a fixed future, but because they could perceive the patterns emerging from present conditions and could articulate the choices that would lead toward flourishing rather than destruction. And most threateningly to the emerging patriarchal structures, they embodied a form of authority that required no external validation, no military force, no hierarchical organization. People came to them voluntarily, seeking healing or guidance, and they offered what they could without requiring payment or allegiance or conversion to any particular doctrine. Their power was the power of the sun itself, freely given, endlessly renewable, available to all who opened themselves to receive it. But the priests who served Amun and the other gods of the state could not tolerate this. Nefertari continued, her words carrying the weight of witnessed tragedy. They understood that if people could access divine consciousness directly through the solar daughters, the entire apparatus of temple and priesthood would become unnecessary. So they began a campaign of suppression that lasted generations, slowly and systematically eliminating the lineage, killing the girls who were identified at birth as potential carriers of the solar transmission, destroying the temples where we practiced, declaring that the solar mysteries could only be accessed through the mediation of male priests who served Ra as an external god rather than as an internal reality. She described watching as her sisters in the lineage were hunted down, as the astronomical knowledge that allowed the identification of solar daughters at birth was declared forbidden and its practitioners executed. as the direct solar worship that required no temples and no priests was replaced with the elaborate state religion that made the pharaoh into the sole intermediary between Ra and humanity. And she described Akhenaten's attempt to restore what had been suppressed, his revolution that tried to bring back the direct relationship with solar consciousness, and how that revolution was crushed by the priesthood that had too much invested in the mediated system to allow the direct path to be reopened. Akhenaten understood, Nefertari wrote. He had been taught by one of the last solar daughters before she was killed by the priests of Amun. He knew that the Aten, the solar disk he tried to restore as the sole object of worship, was not meant to be worshipped as an external deity, but recognized as the symbol of the consciousness that lived within all beings, the creative principle that the solar daughters had embodied and channeled. But he was a man and a pharaoh, and he could not fully embody what only women who carried the lineage could embody. So his revolution failed, and with its failure came the final suppression of the solar daughters. I am the last. After me, the lineage will be broken. But I write this testimony and seal it here, trusting that the solar consciousness itself will ensure that what was hidden will eventually be found when the time is right for its return. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. Yasmin read through the scroll with tears streaming down her face, understanding that she had discovered not just an archaeological curiosity, but evidence of a systematic suppression, a deliberate erasure of feminine spiritual authority that had shaped the development of Western civilization's understanding of the divine as exclusively masculine, of power as necessarily hierarchical, of access to sacred consciousness as requiring institutional mediation. The solar daughters represented everything that the patriarchal religious structures could not tolerate. Direct access, feminine embodiment, power that served rather than dominated, authority that required no coercion. She spent the next year studying the chamber and the body and the scroll, working with a small team of specialists who understood that what they were dealing with was not just historically significant, but spiritually explosive. The body's preservation remained unexplained by any conventional analysis, and several team members reported experiencing visions when they spent extended periods in the chamber, seeing Nefertari not as a corpse, but as a living presence, as though her consciousness had remained tethered to the physical form, waiting for someone to read her testimony and understand its implications. Yasmin herself began having dreams where she found herself in the solar temples that had been destroyed, watching the solar daughters perform their ceremonies, channeling light that flowed through their bodies and radiated outward to heal and guide and nourish all who came seeking their help. And in these dreams, Nefertari would appear and speak to her, teaching her things that were not in the scroll, showing her practices that could not be communicated through written words, but only through direct transmission from consciousness to consciousness. "You have found what I hid," Nefertari said in one such vision, "and in finding it, you have activated something that has been dormant in your own blood. You are not of the direct lineage, but you carry the potential that all women carry, the capacity to channel solar consciousness if you learn the practices and dedicate yourself to the work." The suppression was never complete. It could not be complete because what we embodied was not an accident of genetic inheritance, but an activation of potentials that exist in every human being, expressed most naturally through feminine biology, but accessible to any consciousness willing to do the work of alignment. She taught Yasmin techniques of solar meditation, practices that involved sitting under the sun at specific times of day and opening oneself to receive not just the physical light, but the consciousness that transmitted through that light, the creative intelligence that animated all life and that could be channeled through human awareness when the proper conditions were established. She explained that the mark on her forehead was not just a symbol, but an actual transformation of tissue that occurred when the solar consciousness had been fully embodied, a physical evidence of a metaphysical reality that science had no framework for understanding. And she revealed the prophecy that she had seen before her death, the vision that had sustained her through the final suppression and that had given her the faith to hide her testimony rather than allow it to be destroyed with her body. "I saw that 3,000 years would pass," she told Yasmin, "and in that time, the suppression of the feminine solar mysteries would become so complete that most humans would not even know what had been lost. But I also saw that the age of suppression would end, that consciousness would evolve to a point where the direct path could be reopened without immediately triggering the violent reaction that had characterized every previous attempt. And I saw that women would begin to remember, not through finding hidden texts or preserved bodies, but through direct activation, the solar consciousness itself, calling them back to the practice, inviting them to embody once again what the solar daughters had embodied." Yasmin understood that she was being called not just to document her discovery, but to serve as a bridge, to help re-establish the lineage not as a literal genetic succession, but as a spiritual practice that could be learned and transmitted by anyone willing to dedicate themselves to it. She began teaching what Nefertari had taught her, working with small groups of women who felt called to explore their own capacity for channeling solar consciousness. And she watched as they developed abilities that seemed impossible according to materialist paradigms, but that were entirely natural according to the understanding that consciousness was not produced by the brain, but channeled through it. Some of the women discovered healing capacities, the ability to perceive and work with the energy field in ways that accelerated recovery from illness and injury. Others developed oracular gifts, speaking insights that proved accurate and helpful, even though they came from depths that bypassed rational analysis. All of them reported feeling more alive, more connected, more purposeful as they practiced the solar meditations and learned to embody the consciousness that flowed through them when they opened themselves to receive it. And Yasmin herself underwent a transformation that was visible to everyone who knew her, a radiance that seemed to emanate from her very being, a quality of presence that drew people to her, not because she claimed authority, but because she embodied something that humans had been starving for, without knowing what they were missing: the nourishing power of the feminine solar mysteries, the capacity to give life without demanding submission, to offer light without requiring payment, to serve as a channel through which the creative consciousness of the universe could flow into the world. In her final years, as illness began to claim her body but left her consciousness more luminous than ever, Yasmin arranged for the chamber to be sealed again, understanding that Nefertari's body and testimony needed to remain hidden until humanity was truly ready to receive what they represented without immediately trying to control or commercialize or institutionalize it. She encoded the location in ways that would guide future seekers when the time was right, trusting the same solar consciousness that had guided Nefertari 3,000 years earlier. Before she died, she returned to the chamber one last time, descending the shaft that her team had excavated and sitting in meditation before the sarcophagus, where Nefertari's body still lay in its mysterious preservation. And in that meditation, she experienced a vision that was more real than ordinary reality, a joining of her consciousness with Nefertari's consciousness and with the consciousness of all the solar daughters who had come before. A lineage that stretched back not just 3,000 years, but tens of thousands, back to the very origins of human spiritual practice, when the relationship with the sun was not worship, but partnership, not submission, but collaboration. "You have done well," the combined consciousness of the solar daughters told her. "You have read the testimony, you have practiced the techniques, you have taught others. The lineage that was broken in form has been restored in essence, and that is what matters." The solar consciousness does not require genetic inheritance. It requires only willingness, dedication, the courage to embody power that serves rather than dominates. The humility to recognize that true authority comes not from external validation, but from alignment with the creative principle of the universe itself. They showed her the future that was emerging. Women all over the world beginning to remember their capacity for channeling solar consciousness, activating abilities that patriarchal religion had declared impossible and that materialist science had dismissed as superstition, demonstrating through their very being that the divine was not distant but intimate, not masculine alone, but the sacred union of masculine and feminine principles, not transcendent alone but immanent in every cell and every breath and every moment of conscious presence. Yasmin died with a smile on her face, and those who found her said that her body bore the same mark that Nefertari's body bore, the symbol on the forehead that indicated full embodiment of solar consciousness, the sign of the solar daughters that had been hidden for 3,000 years, and that was now beginning to appear again in women who had never heard of the lineage, but who carried its potential in their very cells, waiting only for the activation that came when consciousness evolved. Enough to hold the power without being corrupted by it, when the feminine could embody solar authority without triggering the fear that had driven the suppression, when the Eye of Ra could be recognized not as the weapon of a jealous god, but as the nourishing gaze of the creative consciousness that births all worlds and all beings, and that invites all who are willing to become channels through which that creativity can flow into manifestation, transforming the world not through force, but through the power of light itself, freely given, endlessly available. The solar mysteries that were forbidden, but that could never truly disappear because they were written not just in scrolls and tombs, but in the consciousness of the sun itself, waiting patiently for humanity to remember and to reclaim what was always theirs. And if you like this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.